Hello, this is Joe from Camera Lessons Online. We're going back to basics right now, and today we're going to do an introduction to shutter speed. Here we go. So it's back to school season right now, and that got me thinking it was a good time to finally do a back to basics portion for this channel, and that's going to be a couple videos on the essential components of building an exposure, and we're going to get right into that with shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and we're going to do a how to shoot anything video and try to build on some concepts along the way. So today is going to be shutter speed. Before we jump into that, of course, everything we do here is brought to you by Camera Lessons Online, and what we believe in is that the ability to create wonderful visual art is an accessible skill to everybody. So to make that happen, we do the YouTube channel, we have the website, we have a 4-hour introduction to photography course, and we have a couple books on there as well on macro photography and travel photography. I encourage you to go check it out. I'll put a link in the description. So today we're going to jump into shutter speed. Now, if you're very new to photography, we control light in our camera. In other words, we adapt to it in an environment through 3 mechanisms. The first one, what we're talking about today, is how long we use light for. The second one is how much light we use. And the third one is how sensitive to that light we are. We call these 3 components the exposure triangle. And we call it the exposure triangle drawn as an equilateral triangle because mathematically each one of these components is considered equally important and has the same consequences to the overall exposure. We're going to start with the amount of light that we use, or how long we're using it for, rather. And we call that shutter speed. Now, I'm actually not a big fan of the term shutter speed because people very new to photography mistake shutter speed as having something to do with the actual operational speed of the piece of equipment, and that could not be further from the truth. You actually have a shutter mechanism inside of your camera, and it's actually 2 pieces of material, plastic or cloth, depending on the camera, and these move vertically. You have your first curtain, which actually covers the sensor. It moves up and allows light to pass through the lens and hit the sensor. The second curtain falls behind it, closing up that gap and stopping the exposure. Then the mechanism resets. This happens over and over again, and the duration of time that light can pass by the shutter and expose onto the sensor, we call that a shutter speed. Because this is a more accurate way of thinking about the process, I like to call this the shutter duration. We have the shutter duration, and we measure the period of time that light passes by the shutter mechanism now that it's open, and it exposes light onto the sensor. We measure this period of time, and that is going to be what we call a shutter speed. Now, this is measured as fractions of time or eventually into full seconds. So if you see 1/60, that's a 60th of a second. If you see a 2 with a quote mark, that's going to be 2 full second exposure, meaning the time from the first curtain opening to the second curtain closing is going to be 2 full seconds. And you can have exposures in cameras today as long as 30 to 60 seconds and as brief as between an 8,000th and in some cameras even a 32,000th of a second. Now, why would we change shutter speed? We would do so for one of 2 reasons. If the light in the environment is too bright or too dark, we might shoot for a briefer or a longer period of time in order to get a proper exposure. So we might do it for exposure reasons. The second is we might change shutter speed in order to have an effect on the motion within the frame. So talking about shutter speed requires that we talk about motion. Now, as we discuss motion and motion blur or crisp motion, it's important to keep in mind what seems like on the surface a very basic idea, and that is that in photography, we do not deal with indivisible periods of time. Any period of time you think about in the world of photography can be divided into smaller subsegments, and I'll give you an idea. Your shutter speed probably tops out in your camera at an 8,000th of a second. That's the briefest period of time that you can actually build an exposure in. But you can easily imagine that a 1/8,000th of a second is actually comprised of 2 1/16,000th of a second exposures buttressed together. And we could do that for any number that we would deal with in photography. So that means that any shutter speed you select can be thought of as a collection of shorter moments that happen sequentially, one after the other. But when we shoot a photograph, say for a 60th of a second, we're taking all of those moments For instance, if we shoot a 1/60th of a second exposure, that can be thought of as 2 1/125th of a second exposures or 4 1/250th of a second exposures. And we're building one visual image of all of those moments and compressing them together. And thus, everything that happens during those periods of time is visually seen as if it happened simultaneously. And as a result, that is motion blur. So if we have something that appears in two different portions of the frame throughout a single exposure, it will appear in both of them, and that we visually perceive as motion blur. So if something is moving through the frame, say from camera left to camera right, then as it moves, if we see it move through more of the frame, we perceive more motion blur. So a faster shutter speed would allow that object to move through less of the frame and thus have less motion blur. For any motion you can think of, there would be an appropriate shutter speed that would capture it in one single area, meaning no motion blur. This can happen even with very fast exposures, such as this image here of a strawberry dropping into a bowl of water. Now, what's really important is that I can have something moving and shoot a slower shutter speed and thus force motion blur to happen, such as this image of the horse and rider. So now I want you to imagine an object moving through a frame from camera right to camera left, and the exposure time is 1/60th of a second. Now, as we explained before, you can think of 1/60th of a second as 4 1/250th of a second exposures. Here's what's key. Let's say that I'm shooting a picture of an unmoving object for a 1/60th of a second, and there's a constant light source hitting it, say sunlight hitting a tree. That means that if we looked at a briefer period of time, then there's less light hitting it because we're adding that light on top of the object throughout the exposure. And let's say that an appropriate exposure on this tree would be a 1/60th of a second. So we've built an exposure where we need that light to build up on the subject for a 1/60th of a second. But we just said that an exposure of 1/60th of a second can also be thought of as 4 1/250th of a second exposures. Each one of those would then be only 1/4 as bright as we want the image to be, because it's 1/4 the period of time. So now imagine an object moving from camera right to camera left. As it moves, let's say that we have 4 distinct moments, 4 1/250th of a second exposures. One when the subject is at the far right, one at the slight right, one at the slight left, one at the extreme left. Now, as that subject moves through there, we can think of that as 4 1/250th of a second exposures with that object lit only 1/4 as bright as it actually needs to be, meaning that that subject is getting dimmer as it blurs. This is an important concept. The more that an object blurs in the frame, the dimmer it gets. So let me show you an example. Here's an image at a 15th of a second of me moving through the space where I record these videos. At a 15th of a second, I appear in just those few portions of the frame, lit a little bit at each one of them, and thus we perceive it as motion blur. However, if I extend that exposure time to 8 seconds, I can walk through the frame, and as you can see, I don't show up in it at all. You're just going to have to take my word that I did walk through the frame at the exact same pace as the first image. The difference is, since it was 8 seconds, the camera requires an object to be lit with an amount of light equal to 8 seconds of constant exposure time to be properly exposed. I was so dim at each one of those points throughout the frame that I effectively vanished. You can do this experiment yourself. Set up a long exposure, start it, walk in front of the camera. You will not appear in the image. Here's another example of the exact same concept. Let's take a look at this blurred shot of the horse moving through the frame. If we look in at the legs, we'll see that the farther out from the center of the leg movement we get, in other words, areas where the leg was sitting in that portion of the frame for the briefest period of time, they are vanishing more. So if you want to play with actually making moving objects vanish within the frame, all you need is a long enough shutter speed. The ability to play with vanishing objects motion blur, and crisp action gives you enormous creative range as a photographer. So, shutter speed is an essential component of building a proper exposure. It allows us to control crisp motion as it moves through the frame, or blurring motion. And if I want an object to disappear, I just need to blur it to an extreme amount. Changing shutter speed will also give me the ability to have a bright enough or a dark enough image if that's what I am going for. Thank you so much for joining me here at Camera Lessons Online. We're going to come back and our next episode is going to be about ISO. Thanks for joining me. Of course, if this is useful to you or at least entertaining, like everybody else on YouTube, I'm going to ask you to like and subscribe. You knew that. It's free. And thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you next time.